Have you covered classes yet? Or have you covered functions yet? Okay. Yeah, methods. Methods and functions are two words that can be used interchangeably. I'll try to stick to the terminology methods today if it seems like that's what you've been covering in your classes. Have you worked with them at all? Oh, you said yes. Oh, okay, cool. So yeah, today we're going to be going into methods. So here, let me share my screen with you and pull up the notes. So how tonight's webinar is going to work is I'm going to present the first half. We're going to just go over a brief overview as to what methods are, why we use them, just do a quick review of those, and then Seven's going to go over some examples and some practice problems. So yeah, so what methods are is methods kind of are like ways you can extrapolate blocks of code in your program, and you can call them numerous times as opposed to like writing the code over and over again. So instead of having a lot of code in main, we can pull this code out and put it in a separate function and name that function whatever we want our method to be called. And then whenever we want to run this code, we can just call the method by its name. So in this example right here, we created a method, method1. And as you can see, we have some lines of code represented by our statements. Oops. And then whenever we want to call method1, we can just type method1, as well as some parentheses, which I'll go into later about what those represent. And then we can have more statements, and then we can either call method1 again if we want to use method1, or like in this example, we can have method2. And for methods, we're allowed to have as many methods as we possibly need to get our job done. So kind of going into what those parentheses represent. So this is what a typical method signature looks like. The first word represents the visibility. So most of the time, we'll be dealing with public methods to start. More and more about classes, you'll learn about why you would want a private method versus a public method, or maybe a protected one. But as of right now, public means that everyone can see it, and it's kind of like how the computer knows to run main. Like main is an example of a public method. And so for all the work we'll be doing until we learn about classes and your teachers go over them a little more in depth, for our purposes, all of our methods will be public. The second thing, in the structure of a method is going to represent, in the signature of a method is the return type. So methods take in some variables represented by our parameters here, and these can be any type of object or any type of variable, whether it be primitive or an object, and it can have as many parameters as you want. And then what a method returns is you're going to be shown right here. And again, this can also be any type of primitive, or it can be an object. However, methods can only return one item, and then the type of this item is located right here. One important thing to point out is that while your parameters need names, so they know what you're using when you reference them, the return type doesn't, and we just want the type of their variable here, type in whatever it's called. If you don't want to return anything in your code, you're going to put a keyword called void here. So for example, when you run main, main doesn't have a return type. When main ends, it doesn't return anything else. That's just the end. So main has a return type of void. The third item you'll see in a method signature is the name of the method. So for example, this would be a method called average, which would hypothetically take the average of numbers 1 and 2. And so this name could be whatever you want, either be made up of numbers or letters. Typically, methods start with a lowercase, and then oftentimes we'll use what's called camel case if you want to name multiple words, but different people like to name their methods differently. It's all based off of personal preference. Do you guys have any questions about the method signature? If you do, you can go ahead and ask them in the chat window. Okay, awesome. Then we can go ahead and keep going. Next, we're going to cover the structure of a method. So like we said, we already discussed how to do our signature. So for example, this is a public method. Again, so all of our methods for starting are going to be public. It's going to return some kind of double called average, and the method itself is called average. And it takes in a number int2. It looks like it was, this is the example from before. It was supposed to have num1 and num2, so let's pretend that was still there. So then it creates a double average, and it sets that equal to the average of those two numbers, and it returns it. What's really important to note here is that these num1 and num2 only exist inside the method itself. And outside of the method, they'll just get thrown away. And that is a property because these are primitive. So any changes we were to make to num1 and num2 wouldn't take effect outside of the program. However, if num2, instead of being an int, was, for example, an array of ints, if we were to change any of the values inside that array, then those changes would be permanent and would still be in effect once the method returns. And that's kind of where it depends on if your method takes into as parameters primitives or objects. So for primitives, none of the changes will, but for object variables, they will, the changes you make to the variable will stay even as the method returns and goes back to wherever called it. However, the specific references of the parameters, those are just all temporary, and we like to refer to those as local variables. And then to return a value, you can just say return, and then whatever variable name you have that is of the type that you specified in your return statement of the method signature earlier. Does anyone have any questions about the structure of a method? Again, the code you have inside a method can be whatever you want, as long as the it always concludes with a return type of whatever you specified earlier. So any questions on that? Okay. Okay. So we can go on. And you might be wondering, like, oh, here's another example. So yeah, this is an example of like applying our average function from before. So these should be, I don't know why that's a string, that should be an integer. This, I believe this is an example from the book, so we'll have to let them know about that. But those integers, average took in integers, so we then would take the average of the integers we pass in, and then to save the value we return, we have to save it in a variable. So like, for example, we created a double AVG, and we set that equal to our average method. And that means that when average returns, that value will automatically be saved in this double AVG here. One thing to note is that the names of the things in the methods don't have to match the things outside of it. So for example, method is the name of the variable passed in, but inside the method itself, we refer to it as int num2. And another thing to keep in mind is the value we return is titled average, but we store it as AVG, and that's has to do with that whole local variable thing. So the names and the references in here are all temporary, and because it's a primitive, none of the changes If we were to change num1 or num2, none of those changes were affected. But again, let's say we pass in an array. Well, the name of the array might change, and it would still be a local reference to it in here. If we made changes to any specific value within the array, those changes would stay present as we returned to our main, or whatever called the function. So yeah. So again, please ignore some of the inconsistencies with this example. This should be an integer here because that is what the average method took. And the compilers won't actually allow you to run this code, and because you're trying to pass in a string into a method that takes an integer, it will throw you a compiler error. And that's just one thing to look out for, especially on the AP exam, because they will try to trick you by mixing up the types of the variables you're passing into the code. Does that make sense? Or do you guys have any questions up to this point on the structure of methods? Okay. And then the next question is, when would you use method? So if you're using a lot of code over and over again, instead of rewriting the whole thing over and over, you can reuse the code and use a method to do that by pulling out the same chunks. And like, let's say we wanted to call method 1 and find the average of something 3 times in a row. As opposed to writing the code to find the average, those same like 3 or 4 lines over and over again, we can just use a method and write 1 line every time we want to find the average. Another thing that's really good about methods is that we can modularize our code. So basically what that means is you kind of like how you would organize an essay into like different paragraphs. That's what we're going to do here with our code. Our methods kind of represent like what you would consider a paragraph in English. It's a way to condense your ideas and keep them all in one place. And then that way, if you ever like found that your code wasn't working properly, it makes it easier to find where your bugs in your code are, because you can test the methods one by one to make sure that they're each doing the task that they're supposed to, as opposed to trying to go through the whole code line by line and figure out where you went wrong. And then a little bit later, we'll go more into objects and classes, and we're going to look into how methods will define the behavior of an object. So for example, let's say if we had a cat object, for those of you who have covered classes, a method can represent like meow or eat food. And then what's cool about methods is sometimes they can be even used for different classes. But we'll go into that a bit more next week or on Sunday at that webinar, and we'll cover this more in depth in future webinars. So yeah, does anyone have any questions about why you would use a method? Why you would use a method? No? Okay, then 7 is going to then take over and lead us through some examples of methods in practice. Okay, 7? How do I stop sharing?
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. You guys see that?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. So I will go over some of the parameter passing rules with you guys. So basically, if you look at this code, parameter is located right here. So basically, this is our main, and then we have our method called add2, and then in our method called add2, we have our parameter int x. So basically, what you can do with the parameters is that when you pass them into the methods, you can change the values and perform some other operation to the passed-in parameters. So there are two different types of parameter passing, and the first one is called passing by value. So this basically means when you pass in a parameter here, or when the parameter is used in the method either for writing or reading, we are actually using the copy of the variable and not the original value. So for example, we have an integer x called 10 or assigned 10, and then we pass this into our method right here. And when we pass this in here and we receive that x here, we don't actually receive the whole memory of x, but we're just receiving the copy of the value. So we literally receive the value 10 for this x. And also this can be like any other name. We can name the b, and then it'll be the same, because this is basically just a copy of the value 10. So if you look at this code right here, you pass in 10 to this method called add2. And then in this method, what you do is you add 2 to your variable, the passed-in variable. So when you print out the variable b in here, you would expect 12, because we got 10 passed in here and then we added 2 here, so we get 12. Now, after we finish executing this method, which is this line right here, we go back to main, and then the main executes this line, which tries to print out the value of x. What value do you guys think will x print out? Any ideas or just guess? Okay, I'll just tell you guys the answer. So basically, when I execute this code right here, we see that if you look at the first line, in the method, x actually equals 12, or b right here, should be b, because we added 2 to our passed-in parameter here. But then when we go back out into the main and we try to print out the value x again, we just have 10. So basically, this was an example of pass by value. So basically, when a value is passed into the parameter right here, and we make any changes to the value, that changed value only, or the changes aren't permanent. They're basically temporary just inside the method, and then once you go back out to the main, basically it just treats this line as if like nothing happened. So this is basically nothing, and then when you print out the value for x again, it just prints out 10. Now this is very similar for this example. So before we were looking at integers, and now we're looking at string. It's the same thing. We assign string test the value hello, and then we call a method to change the string by passing in the string variable name test. So once Java gets to this line, we go inside our method, and then if you in our method, we actually change the value of test to goodbye. So when we try to execute this line, this prints out goodbye. So in our method, we print out goodbye. But when we go back out to the main and then we print out the value of test, it actually just prints out the original value. So this is pass by value example. So whatever changes you make in the method only stays in the method, and it doesn't really change the original value in main. Now, if you want to actually change, or you want to return the change value from the method, what you can do is, this is basically very similar. We have the same method name. The only thing different is that instead of having void as a return type, we have a string return type. So when you have void as your function signature, you're not returning anything. But in here, we have string. So basically, this function is returning a string. So we set our test to goodbye, and then we return the value of test in here, which is goodbye. And then what we do is we value to a variable test, so return value of the method, and then we print out test, and this should print out goodbye. So this is when you actually want to change the values. What you would just have to make the method return something, and depending on what kind of data types you're returning, you can just set the names here. You guys have any questions up to this point? Okay, I will go over then the next type of parameter passing. So far we've seen parameter passing, or passing by value, and now we're gonna look at something called passing by reference. So basically, passing by value was you just pass in the copy of the variable. But on the other hand, when you pass in by reference, whatever changes you make on the parameter inside a method will affect the original value. And this is because the method is receiving the reference, which is like the memory address, instead of just like the copied variable. So in this example, if you look right here, we have an array of integers with the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we call the same method add2 by passing in our array. And then, so when you pass in, when you call a function, you have to make sure that these names have to match. But when whatever you're receiving as a parameter, you can name anything. This can be any name. You can also make it numbers to make it like not as confusing. I just have it as X to show you guys that you can name this anything, and this will basically just mean this. So in our method, we just run a for loop from 0 to length. So we are basically going into each element of the array, and we're adding the original value by 2. So what this function, or what this method is doing, you're just adding 2 to each of the elements here. Now, after finish executing this method, we go back to our main, and then what this piece of code does right here is we are just printing out each element in the array. Now, if you execute this, this is a little bit different from our other two examples. We actually have our updated values in our main. So basically, this is like passed by reference, and so whatever changes you make in the method sticks to the, or it also changes the original value. So when you go back out into the main and you just print out the values of main instead of printing out the original values, you will have our updated values. You guys have any questions on this one? Okay, good. These might be a little confusing at first, but the more practice you have on these, you'll have better understanding. So that is basically it for all the materials, and I will give you guys practice questions. And hold on, let me find the link. Give me a sec. Okay. So this is the link to the practice questions. And then I'll give you guys maybe like 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'll go over the answers with you guys after you guys are done doing these practice questions. All right. So seems like both of you guys have submitted answers, so I will go over them. Okay. So let's look at the first question. Okay. So write the signature for a method that takes in an array of integers and returns the average of all the numbers as a double. Please name this function average. So both of you guys did great. You just need public and static. We just have static keyword for now. We'll explain why we need this later on once you guys actually start learning about objects. So we have our signature here, and then we should have double here because remember, when we want to get an average, we want to divide by a certain number, and a lot of the times that gives you decimal points. So we want to return decimal points. And then we have our word average, and then a parameter, which just takes an array, and you can name this anything. And basically, inside the loop, we declare a sum variable, and you just add all the elements in the array to the sum, and then you just divide your sum by how many elements you have in your array. So both of you guys did great on this. And yes. And then our next question, considering the following code, which of the following variables change when the code above is returned? So this is our code right here. And basically what this does is this method receives an array of string, like for example, like Hannah, 7, and Jack. And then it receives an integer of just like a number. So what this method does is it loops through all the elements in the array. So first it'll look at Hannah, and then it counts how many letters that string has. So Hannah has 6 characters, and then it compares to a number that we pass in, and then if that string has, or this length of a string is greater than the number that we pass in as letters, then we are going to just assign that element to this just the number that was passed in. And we have this little plus quotation mark to make it store a string, because letters right now is just integer, but we have an array of strings. So by adding this quotation marks, we are making this whole thing string. And then we have a count variable, and we're just going to increase that. And then at the end, we're going to set our letters to count, and then we return letters. So if you look at this method, the only variables that actually change when you go back to main is the string and names. So remember, as we talked about before, when you make changes to an array and a method, that changes its original value. So the change is permanent. So I think, okay, let me just go through an example that'll be easier to understand this method. So we will go over the last question. So we pass in the array Hannah, 7, Jack, string array. So we look at our first element. The length of our first element is 6. And then we're going to pass in integer 5 as our letters parameter. So 6 is greater than 5. So we run this if statement. And because it's true, we run these 2 lines. So at that element, we are going to, instead of keeping the word Hannah, we are going to instead put in 5 in here. So right now, our array should look like 5, 7. Then our count is 1. Because it was 0, and then we just added our first if statement. Then we look at our second element, and then the length of this is also 6, and this is also greater than 5. So what we do is we go into the element and we change the element to assign value 5, because that's the value of our letters. And then we increase our count by 2. And then lastly, we look at our last element. The length of a string is 4. This is not greater than 5, so this just never runs, and our for loop ends. So at the end, we have our letter equal to count, which is 2, and then we return letters, which is 2. So if you look here, back in the main, the only variable that actually changed values was just the names parameter, because now the names parameter contains 5, 5, jack, and we can see that when I run this loop. So I'm gonna run that loop right there, and that just prints out all the values in our array, and you can see that the array updated to the change value, 5, 5, jack. But our letter right here, this actually doesn't change, because this letter is basically just temporary in this method. So letters right now is 2, but let's say we have int letters equals 5, and then we pass in letters, and then now what is stored in our letters after this method runs. So after this letter gets changed to 2, if we take a look at that, it still contains a value 5. So this was our example with parameter passing by value. Whatever changes you make in here doesn't stick with the changed value when you come out of the method and you go back into our original main. So the only changed variables that occur in the method once you go back to main is just the names array. Do you guys have any questions with this example? Okay, so that is it for today. If you guys have further questions, you guys can always sign up for one-on-one tutoring, which Jack just sent the link to. Just make sure you guys sign up like a day before, so at least we can be notified and prepare time. And if you guys don't have any other questions, that's it for today.
Just a heads up, everyone. Again, Sunday will be our last webinar for the 2017 year, but webinars will pick up on January 7th, and they'll continue again all throughout the end of the school year until the EP exam. The calendar has been updated for the rest of this week if you want to sign up for tutoring. I know there's only a few times in for the week after that, but we'll be adding more. So yeah, we won't have as many times because we have our final exams and then go on break, but we should still have some times up in case you guys need any help. If we don't have a time listed that works for you, feel free to email us back at the riseup4csmd@gmail.com email, and we can always work something out on a one-on-one basis too. So yeah, if we don't see you guys on Sunday, have a great rest of your marking period and a great holiday season. Thanks for coming tonight.